We've got a fantastic panel that are going to introduce themselves quickly, and then we're going to dive into Flux in the carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets. But I just want to say how fantastic this room is. For anyone who's new to the market, there seems to be a lot of wisdom in this room. Already I've seen some people who have been in this market for many years. So it's a great event. Okay, over to the fantastic panel. I feel like a psychoanalyst.
On the couch. Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Lampert. I'm an investment director with Mirova. Mirova is an asset manager specialized in responsible and sustainable investing. I'm part of the natural capital team, where I focus on projects that restore and protect nature using a variety of different revenues, primarily from credits sold on the voluntary carbon market. I'm also looking at other ideas such as biodiversity credits or nature certificates, as well as more kind of traditional ways of supporting conservation, such as ecotourism or other types of approaches. So nice to meet you all.
Hello, everyone. Cheri Sugal. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Integrity Global Partners. We are a relatively new company of founding team of long-time carbon market experts who've been in the space doing technical work, structured finance work. The company's mission is to unlock capital at scale, particularly for nature-based solutions projects, and to work primarily with asset managers and institutional investors to be able to de-risk projects and really architect deals for investors to be able to deploy capital at, as I mentioned, a much greater scale than where it is today. And my personal background is having spent many, many years working on financing, conservation, large-scale wilderness protection and restoration, and really pioneering in the late 90s a lot of the very early deals that we have seen coming to fruition in the carbon markets. So pleased to be here. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks. I'm Alexis Moyer. I'm the head of business development at a company called Space Intelligence. We're an Edinburgh-based nature tech company that uses satellite data, field data, and artificial intelligence to provide support to nature-based solutions projects. So that's really supporting projects from initial screening all the way through to origination and ongoing monitoring, reporting, and verification.
Hi, I'm Jenny Henman. I'm the founder and chairman of Plant Your Future. We're a charity nonprofit working in the Peruvian Amazon with smallholder farmers to help them adapt and adopt to regenerative agriculture, so introducing agroforestry and tree planting. Our project's a VCS CCB project. And more broadly, I've worked in the forestry and land use carbon world for a long time on kind of all sides of the table, from being at Shell and BP to writing some of the early PDs in the VCS sector to working at the Nature Conservancy and being one of the original developers of the CCB standard.
Wow, that is impressive. So the topic for our session was around markets being in a state of flux. The slide in front of us seems to, the name has changed, but that's what we're going to talk about. And you could say, well, what do you mean by flux? Is it the fact that we're seeing turmoil in prices? What's the difference between short-term, long-term pricing? But I think what we want to start with is probably the elephant in the room, which is the drum roll that seems to continue from press and elsewhere around critiques around the voluntary carbon market, and focusing on the reliability of claims, the reliability of credits, and the integrity around that. And so we're going to dive into a few different topics around that. But first, I want to kick off with a panel and just hit you with, is it fair? What's the take? You know, where there's smoke, there's fire. You know, to what extent do people see this as a valid critique? And there are a range of them, but I might go to Cheri first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've done a lot of thinking around this. It's always good to have, critiques on what you're doing. But I would say that in the media attention that we've seen recently, especially in the last few months coming out, I think has painted a broad brush stroke over, the supply of credits coming into the market. And I think that has been really what it should have been, was really focused on a few projects. And even the some of the pieces that we've seen showing, the percentage of credits coming into the market, 90%, this many, are all fake and all of that. It's just, simply not true, right? We've had a lot of outside analysis on the studies on which those media, those articles were based to show that those studies were actually flawed. And, the reality is that it's very complicated to measure and determine a counterfactual that hasn't occurred yet. And the work of actually projecting deforestation into the future is actually, it can be pretty difficult. It is a very localized phenomenon, and I think a lot of the studies on which, those articles were based were really taking randomly selected areas, which you really can't do. So there's a lot of reasons that I would say those articles are not representative of what's really going on in the supply, particularly of REDD+ credits coming in the market. And at the same time, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to say this is not a reason, because there are some flaws or some challenges, it's not a reason to abandon this very important tool that we need to finance, conservation and finance nature-based solutions. What it is a reason, it gives us, another perspective on how we can improve the integrity of these projects. And one of the things that is really key is that, and one of the criticisms that is correct, is that a lot of REDD+ projects have used what's called reference regions to try to look at what would happen in your project area. That's sort of the best we could do, right? For many, many years, those are the best tools that we had available. And then over time, you say, did deforestation occur in the reference region the way that we projected or not? And so in some cases, it hasn't, right? And so what that does shed light on is changes that are happening in the industry already, not because of those articles, but because we've always known that needed to change. Anyone who's worked on these projects for a long time, like myself, knew that we would adopt risk-allocated jurisdictional baselines for those projects. And right now, Vera has come up with new methodologies that allow us to do that in specific locations. And so so it's really a call to action, I think, to say, let's really get behind the technical changes and adaptations that are happening in the market that will allow us to have a greater level of certainty in the projections we're making in these particular types of projects.
Okay, I'm going to come to technology in a bit, and I'm also going to come to Sam, but I just wanted to, Jenny, considering your history, your involvement with on the ground work around methodologies and project design, etc. What's your take on that? That perfect being the enemy of the good. To what extent can we accept that standards should evolve and will evolve, and that can deliver robust claims during a period of evolution?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the heavy criticism and critique of the sector that's come out in the media over the last few months or so, in some ways I kind of question what the end goal of it is, because it's really, really critical to protect forest and to restore areas which have already been degraded and promote more regenerative agriculture. And I think that I feel like the articles, I don't know entirely what the end game was, because you do definitely want integrity to be improved, but I'm not sure that there was a clear, really, really clear understanding of what's already happening. So I felt like some of these articles were coming quite late to the table and weren't acknowledging improvements that were already being made. Obviously, I'm sure as most people in this room know, Vera's done a huge amount of methodology work the last few years to try and overcome some of these problems. And Vera had no vested interest in the methods not being the best they possibly can be. But it's extremely complex, as Cheri said, to do these counterfactual baselines. And they've been building everything up from zero originally. So I feel that it's very important that we can rely on the core standards which underpin the whole sector. So, that's the standards that come out of Vera, the gold standards, or any other standards that emerge. And I think they are working hard to improve. I think with so many different actors shouting, different things at the sector, and particularly about lack of integrity, there are some vested interests about what those actors are trying to get out of it. But it's really, really important we keep our eye on the ball and are still ensuring that we are having money flowing into forest protection and we are having money flowing into forest restoration. And there is no benefit to totally undermining the sector and kind of throwing everything up in the air. And certainly, like the Vera and the gold standard processes for developing methods are very thorough, and they are using the world's leading experts who, in developing those methods, do not make huge amounts of money, actually, in the actual methodology piece. It's a very thorough process with various levels of review in it. So I think to undermine that is dangerous, because that is the best system we've got. And I know we're going to talk a bit more about rating agencies and so on down the road, but I think we have to believe in the end of the day that we've got standards we can rely on at the base of the sector. And yeah, Vera's working really hard to improve those. And you know, there's a public comment period, etc. So everyone can be involved in that. It's very transparent. So I think we have to continue to see that as the foundation of the sector, and we have to make sure we can have confidence in it.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Sam. I guess as a fund manager, you work with your investors, and we've almost immediately dropped in some to the sort of the technical, into the weeds, the technical around methodologies, etc. But how do you find the interplay with your investor groups around these issues on integrity and what they're looking for and what they're worried about?
Yeah, so I think I'm incredibly lucky to have investors that are very, very, very oriented around projects that are able to generate carbon credits that have high integrity. That is somewhat of a moving target of what that means and how you define that. But I'm very, very lucky to kind of have that as a mandate. And when you see articles such as that are kind of critiquing the entire market, all of a sudden they get very, very nervous. None of my investors are doing this for a financial return. They are operating with kind of under broader kind of mandates around sustainability and impact. And so that ultimately what they see is that the reputational risks of being engaged in the voluntary market are greater than the reputational benefits of being engaged around being net zero and kind of the way that fits with overall broader commitments. They'll say, well, let's get out of this, or they'll say nature is too hard, or they'll say something that they can kind of find a different way of approaching it. And for me, that's a massive risk right now that all of us as people who are engaged in and kind of committed to the success of the voluntary market are kind of facing. And so I think then to kind of go back to some of the other conversations around kind of the relationships between standards bodies and ratings, there is kind of ultimately the decision of the investor, who is either investing in supporting a project or purchasing the credits, and making sure that that investor has adequate information to make good decisions that really reflect, yes, the carbon avoided or carbon removed that occurs, but also all the other implications of the projects, whether it is around sharing benefits with local communities, whether it is kind of externalities around biodiversity, and making sure that those are kind of able to be understood holistically, and the importance of the investor to do that.
Yeah, I guess fair or not, well, actually, I'm going to say one thing. Sorry, moderator bursting out of moderator role for a second. It is notable how silent the significant buyers in the world are. You know, you're talking about vested interests with a particular critique of, frankly, emissions trading generally, and then the voluntary market. But we just often don't see people prepared to put their head above the parapet and say, look, I do see this as a key tool towards my net zero goals. I do think it's legitimate for me to use this as a path, and we need more of that. But sorry, I'll get off my high horse. Fair or not, it is clear that buyers are sort of looking for more than just the standard said this credit is okay. So, Alexis, I just want to talk to you about your company, but to what extent do technology tools or things that sit slightly outside of a standard offer a path to give that enhanced reliability or views on the underlying project?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really something that there's a lot of scope for right now. Clients are coming to us looking for additional assurance on project performance, whether that is projects that are in pre-feasibility stage, projects that have been established for years that may have been cited in a bad press article, for example, and they really want assurance that the projects are performing as they should be. So that would be an extra kind of due diligence analysis as Cheri was saying, looking at different risk assessment models, looking at properly matched sites. So that's not choosing a random area, that's using local knowledge, working with the project developer, working with local stakeholders to really assess areas that are similar to your project area and seeing how those perform through time against your protected project area. In terms of post-investment, so that's pre-investment due diligence. After you've already invested in a project or developed a project, there's an additional component of digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, so that it's over and on top of what, for example, Vera and Gold Standard require, which is using satellite data to provide insight on an annual basis or a more frequent basis, looking at those planted sites if it's an afforestation project, or looking at the protected site if it's a REDD+ project, and analyzing, for example, carbon stock changes through time, analyzing for illegal deforestation, analyzing for natural deforestation through storm damage, for example. And that's something, for example, we work with Green Gold Forestry on. They have a project in Peru, and we're assessing these changes every year for them to really make sure that the project is performing as it should and that they can pick up these red flags before they become a problem that's reported globally as a negative project component, really. And then the final thing I wanted to add as well is that really clients and investors, project developers, are looking for actionable insight. So they're looking for data that can tell them, yes, I should invest in this, or no, I should not invest in that. And that's something we're actively doing with many of our clients now, is providing data that can help them decide, should I invest in this project? And several clients actually have used our data to say, actually, I'm going to pass on this one because there's some red flags here. So that's the kind of information that is available through the use of satellite data and other technology tools.
Okay, so two things out of that. I'm going to go to Jenny and then you, Cheri. That sounds fantastic, frankly, but to what extent should this sit outside of standards, or is this should evolve to be the approach of standards? Do you have views on that, Jenny, of like how should the verification process or the validation process evolve to pick up the sort of technology options, or is it better to see it as a value add outside of the base case of a standard?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a difference between the rating agents and what organizations like Space Intelligence are doing, because they're more coming on a particular basis, can be supporting the project developer or could be supporting a particular client. I think the risk with the rating agencies, obviously it's quite new, the rise of the rating agencies, is just how that interplays with the standards. And obviously the rating agencies are kind of, they're choosing their people, they're choosing their systems. It's like not as transparent as the way that the methods and the standards have been developed. So I sort of have some caution over that. And also, just in general, there's been a lot of investment by the sector into these areas, and still there continues to be an absolute dearth of investment into actual project activities. So as someone who's developing a reforestation project in the Amazon, it can be a little frustrating to have people speculating so much over your project instead of actually giving us finance to improve our activities and implement and include more smallholders in our program. So I feel like there's been extreme proliferation over platforms for checking projects, etc. Obviously, there's some really good ones like Space Intelligence, but there's many, many out there. Some of them are just doing it, for financial gain. So I do think there has to be a balance and ensuring that there's still a decent amount of money actually flowing to the projects instead of huge fees going to intermediaries to check the activity, which at some level feels like what's happening, because often investors aren't so informed in, they're nervous about investing in the global south in these very rural rainforest environments, which they know little of. So they are willing to pay quite large fees for someone to check that. And then that really eats into the money that's available to invest.
Cheri, reactions?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to talk about and a lot to unpack, but I would just say that that the whole market is really evolving, and the technology surrounding this space is evolving very, very quickly, and the standards are not necessarily catching up as fast. And so we can utilize all of this new technology that's coming into the space to be able to improve the integrity of these projects without having to wait for the standards to catch up, right? The standards were not necessarily written with the same level of the same eye that a investor who's putting significant upfront capital into these projects is looking at them, over long term and measuring risk and trying to figure out if this is an actual, like, completely accurate projection of what's going to happen. So I think it's incumbent on all of us, and we're partners with Space Intelligence to try to really improve the integrity of these projects as we're bringing that supply, into the market. And the role for me of rating agencies, I mean, it's not that helpful to kind of look back on a project. I mean, this is coming from the perspective of creating that supply. But what's really valuable is that there are a lot of really smart people thinking about how do you develop a really, what does good look like, right, in a project. And so we can utilize a lot of that thinking and that intelligence that's coming out of the rating agencies to design the best projects that we possibly can, right? And so some of the things, I know we're not talking that much about cook stoves in this conference, but some of the recent analyses that have come out of the rating agencies looking at cook stove projects is really shedding a light on why from many different perspectives, cook stove projects may be overissuing credits. And then that can give us a signal to say, okay, what do we need to do to really improve the accuracy of the way that we're measuring the emission reductions, from those projects. And a really interesting technological solution is using IoT devices, right? So we can get direct field measurements, of how much wood was being used versus how much wood is being used today. You can put a heat sensor, on a cook stove. That's not something that the standards require, but it is something that we can build into the project design to ensure that the projects are having the utmost integrity when we bring them to market.
Interesting. Sam, what are you looking for in terms of additional tools? Because I guess as a fund manager, what you offer to your investors is that curated, focused, long-term management of an investment. But what do you then need to deliver that?
Yeah, so I think ultimately, so what we have relied on historically is, the traditional methodologies. Obviously, the standards bodies, obviously, kind of site visits, kind of long, kind of intense due diligence around kind of making sure that the project is credible. I think we're particularly excited about the way that technology providers can allow us to have new access to insights, and both from a kind of structuring our thinking around kind of, okay, when we say additionality, let's actually do that on a risk-adjusted basis and see kind of how we're thinking about the overall context of kind of what are the other risks in the space. How are we thinking about risks of fire, and kind of the ability that we're able to do analysis is just so much greater and richer than what we would be able to have before. I think in addition, one of the elements that we're really excited about is kind of increasing clarity within the market and consensus around, if we want to have a project that is sustainable, if we want to have a project that will get government support, this is the amount of kind of how you structure it in such a way that the communities have an adequate share of the overall kind of revenues that are coming into the project. And so the way that we can use a variety of different tools to kind of come up with and give a recommendation that, yes, this is a high integrity project. This is a project that will be sustainable over 20 years, despite climate risks, despite regulatory risks. This is a project where we think there will be a long-term and credible impact. And the way that we can do that is incredibly helpful. And as the market matures, as new tools become available, I think we will embrace them very, very eagerly. So.
Well, you mentioned government there, and one thing that we wanted to pivot to in this session is we've been talking about flux in the market driven by expectations around claims, integrity, et cetera, but then the flip that is what is coming, or is already here in many markets but is coming, is what do domestic or national governments think of voluntary carbon projects? How do they approach the regulation of emission reduction projects in their countries, whether nested, whether jurisdictional, et cetera? And there was some press, if you've been looking at Carbon Pulse this morning, anyone, that Zimbabwe has just announced that they want to cancel existing carbon deals and put in a new system where they'll be taking, say, 50% of revenues arising from trades. That's just a microcosm of, frankly, multiple markets around the world which are pivoting to the value of carbon markets, both for their own NDC implementation, but more widely. So I guess I'm going to pick anyone, just jump forward. But it's a pretty tough one to think about as an investor in a project. How does some of these conversations around the evolution of standards or integrity or what have you also help with, I guess, driving a dynamic where that's a recognized part of a country solution? Anybody?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. So I think the way that we think about this is just the evolution of the market over, several decades. I mean, where we are today is very different than where we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. We can no longer develop projects, sort of with blinders on in thinking that we can ignore, governments and the role of governments. Every single government in the world is thinking about these assets now and how these are their assets and how they have kind of been left out of this market. And they're trying to figure out ways that they participate in this. There's been a tremendous amount of work done on the, from the World Bank and the FCPF program, the ISFL. And now there are opportunities for governments to participate in the voluntary carbon market through the JNR standard and Vera and through ART trees. And so every government is thinking, how do we participate in this? So we can no longer ignore that. We're just not, that those days are gone, right? You can't go into a country, you can't just develop a project without involving the government. So when you're thinking about this as a risk, you mitigate that risk by early engagement with the government, solid agreements, airtight, using your law firm, and you do that early as a way to mitigate against that risk. But on the flip side of that, this is also, and I know we have another panel on jurisdictional later this afternoon, we shouldn't only be thinking about it as a risk. We need to think about it as a tremendous opportunity to scale this market, because when we scale the market to a jurisdictional scale, when you think about that, I mean, governments are really the only entity that can truly control land use, in a country, right? They have control over that. It allows for the involvement of indigenous people in these larger scale programs. If we can develop nested projects, within jurisdictional programs, we can also really bring in that project level finance. So it's a risk, but it's also an opportunity, and we have to start thinking about it that way.
Maybe just to build on that, I mean, you correctly said that, one of the important risk mitigants is early engagement with the government.
Mm-hmm.
And another really important risk mitigant is clear rules of the road. And in many markets, there is no regulatory framework for the voluntary carbon market, and so that you're kind of going in there and making investment that will pay back over 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years, and all of a sudden you're saying, I'm hoping that no regulation emerges and there's no kind of fundamental change in place, and kind of that exposes me to risk. And so that kind of the idea of kind of saying, no, these are the rules. You need to have a project that is recognized by the government, that is kind of participating and kind of overseen by the government, and that gives you comfort that the project will be sustainable over a very long time horizon. And that's quite helpful as well.
Yeah. And if anyone isn't aware of it, I highly recommend trying to track down the Ghana announced framework. UNDP help with that. That's effectively, I consider, best in class for a framework that enables voluntary projects and enables corresponding adjustments with additional payments. It has layered approaches to the level of authorization and domestic validation. So it does it all. And then you flip to some of the other models that have come out. And unfortunately, often the voluntary market is not being properly considered as a transition path for much of this. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in. Jenny?
Yeah, I think just a practical reflection. So I think definitely it's good that governments are becoming more involved for many of the reasons that have been mentioned. The challenge is that some, different global south governments have different levels of capacity on this so far. So that can be a bit of a blocker for trying to develop something in a country where you really want to do a project, but yet the governmental capacity and frameworks are so limited still. So that, I think you have to often build in extra time and budget to actually work with government to build their capacity, which obviously is very valuable, but can be quite an additional time. It can add a lot of time to you getting certified potentially, and can also be quite an additional cost. And I think what I've seen myself quite a lot with Global South government departments on this is, because of rapid change of regimes and so on, you can have quite high capacity and some things moving along, and then things can suddenly change quickly. So that is a real challenge for our sector in terms of certainty of deal making.
Yeah, I've heard that's happening in Brazil at the moment with the government change. There's been change in sort of technical skill sets. So I guess, is there a role then, stepping back for a moment, like the voluntary carbon, we're talking about the voluntary carbon market because that is a investment class that has worked and is working. But if we evolve to a world where we can do similar types of projects in a nested sense, which are creating credits under Article 6, etc., then fantastic. We all want to get there or to some sort of path. Do we see a role for the DFIs and other sort of agencies to kind of help these, as you said, Global South countries get the skill sets available to create the right rules, create the right skill sets for validation or what have you? Because I guess what I've seen, unfortunately at times, is a developer might put a lot of investment, as you said in Jenny, but then they don't really want to share that because they put in all the hard yards, so they expect some sort of priority, which then creates issues of its own. Cheri, I think you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, happy to talk about that. I mean, I think that there's a expected risk on these projects, expected return on these projects. The actual return at a project level, we can sort of figure what that looks like, given the time horizon and what we know about the cost of production and what it takes to develop a project. When we scale up to a jurisdictional level, there is a heavy lift involved in doing training and capacity building and stakeholder mapping across an entire region and understanding, who are all these different players. Getting the benefit sharing right is a massive amount of work. Like who gets the financing once it comes in and what's fair, and so figuring out grievance redress mechanisms and SESAs and all the kind of things that we need to do in the voluntary market that we can take lessons from the work, a lot of the work that the World Bank has done. That is not work that a particular investor is going to be able to swallow, right? Like, it's a massive amount of work. The World Bank has already spent over $400 million on sort of that readiness facility before anyone sold any carbon into the carbon fund, right? So there is a really still a big role of concessionary capital to come in and be able to to enable these governments to kind of get ready to sell credits into the voluntary market. And I think that's where that sort of these blended finance facilities are really important and are going to play a critical role, because it's too much for any one investor to kind of do on their own. And a lot of I will say though, a lot of the work that's already been done can be relatively easily repackaged. That can make these, sort of jurisdictional level programs compliant with voluntary market standards like ART trees and Verus JNR. So I think there's some leveraging that can happen there of the concessionary capital that's already come into the space, where we can kind of get these programs over the line. I don't know if there was another part to your question.
we could just keep talking. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Can I get a show of hands of anyone's? Yeah, I know we've got 10. I just want to check if there's questions. There's going to be questions. So anyone else got questions? I just want to fit it in. It's 2 or 3. So we'll, I guess, last comments, and then we'll turn to some questions. What type, in this, for all the issues we talked about, flux in the market, etc., what does that say about the kind of investors that should be looking at this market and the kind of opportunities in the medium to long term? That was a somewhat loaded question, because I would say my experience of past peaks in our market, my CDM days, etc., is you had a lot of traders piling in at times, and they also often wanted to get out when things are tough. So I'm loading the question to, does finding opportunity in a state of flux require a different type of investment mentality? Or no answer?
I mean, I can take it. I mean, I think there's an important distinction between the primary and secondary markets, and the risks that you think about and the motivations that you're looking for in those types of projects. And so that the kind of, as investing in projects, you are taking a very, very long horizon. And what you're looking at requires a patient approach and requires you to be able to kind of say, these are the long-term trends we see around the way there will be a market for purchasing voluntary carbon credits. I think in the secondary market, you're looking at a very, very different horizon. You have a different set of incentives. You introduce some of the problems that Jenny referred to earlier around kind of a significant portion of any gains never actually reaching projects on the ground. And how do you think about that and how do you structure it and kind of as a major kind of challenge while still recognizing the value secondary markets play in providing liquidity and ensuring that the kind of underlying kind of projects that you have in the primary market will actually be able to sell and get revenue and be sustainable over time. So finding the right balance is quite tricky.
Anyone else, or should we turn to questions?
I would just add to that we really need to change the way that we're bringing capital into the space. Like up until now, it's been a very extractive model, and it's taking the capital that's been coming in for various reasons is taking a very large portion of the revenue out of these projects from the generation of carbon credits. And I think if we can think about how do we bring institutional capital, at scale into the space, and we think about all the different risks that we talked about, I know that it can be kind of scary and daunting for institutional investors to think about, how do we do this? But that's what we're trying to do is really be able to kind of de-risk these projects before they end up on book for investors, like really looking at reducing the performance risk through really, really high quality design of these projects very early on, reducing that performance risk on an ongoing basis by taking a role in those projects, bringing portfolios together, structuring deals, looking at the risk return profile for these projects for investors, because I think what there are a lot of great projects out there that never see the light of day, and they never get capital because there's a massive disconnect between the investors and what they're looking for and what these project developers who are out in some place in the world are out there planting trees, right? Somebody has to connect the dots, right, and speak the language of the investors and address the issues very early on. And so, that's what we're trying to do, and with partners like Space Intelligence and others, that we think is a critical gap in the market today.
Thank you. Questions? I think you had a question, right?
Yes.
Do you just want to talk? Can everyone hear, or is there? Oh, sorry, we're going to take the first one up here because the mic's up there, and then we'll come over to you. Scott.
Hi. So I've been told to stand and give my name and company. My name is Cheri Obihara. It's about 3 different companies. I'm Senior Research Fellow 2022 at Project Drawdown. I'm co-founder of the COP26 Climate Action Plan. I sit on the Target Advisory Group for the SBTI. Green Party background. I ran a desk at Morgan Stanley just up the road a few years ago in derivatives. So that's the introduction done. Sorry about that. Just to try and get you to speak more in your very excellent way of framing the difficulties around REDD+, about joining those dots. So from the COP perspective, for example, I think one of the challenges is that everyone's focused on 6.4, Article 6.4, which is about mitigation. But Article 5, which is about forestry conservation, is just as important. And linking those two is just missing in all of these discussions. So going back to the very esteemed panel and asking, in terms of connecting dots and getting solutions to policymakers for actual action, what would be your preferred core steps? Thank you.
Well, that's a tough question. I can take a quick stab, because I think the dynamic that you're touching on that we need to be very careful of, as we saw with the Coalition for Rainforest Nations initiative recently, is that REDD+ mechanism was ultimately designed for results-based payments. Yeah. So it has a lot of robust design elements within it, but it doesn't address things like permanence and risk buffers and all the rest of it. So I don't think it was ever designed to be a credit-based scheme, and yet there's been this constant dynamic where legitimately, for countries are saying, where is the money? They're saying, why can't it be seen as that? And I don't know if others want to pile in on that, but I think the joining the dots is occurring, but it's occurring through things like art trees, which is kind of builds on the jurisdictional work under RED+, but then tries to layer in an additional sort of design elements that gives you that sort of more certainty on the jurisdictional outcomes and the ability to underpin claims. I don't know if anyone has views on that. Well, there you go. I did well.
You got it.
Where's the microphone gone? Yep, here we go. Thank you.
Thank you. John McGarity with Quantum Commodity Intelligence. I'm a journalist who reports on the carbon market. So just got a question for any of you in the panel who would like to answer regarding political risk. How important do you think that the Zimbabwe announcement or briefing was yesterday that Bloomberg, I think, reported first? So well done to them. I think they're in the right place at the right time. And Zimbabwean government, I think, in the past, or certainly this morning, has clarified its position or provided some transparency on the reasoning for its decision, which does seem a bit like a re-nationalisation. It's a bit like Repsol, YPF in Argentina 10 years ago, where I expect this will cause shockwaves through the market. And I'm wondering how project developers, service providers can somehow recalculate the political risk of this sort when the government almost overnight decides to nationalise a huge project. And I'm wondering what insurance firms or law firms or anyone else who's calculating the risk, what can be done, or is this something which is a black swan event that's just very difficult to mitigate against? Thank you.
I'm glad I answered the first question because I don't need to pick up that one.
Well, I guess just an initial comment on that. So obviously political risk is always high in the majority of global south countries where many of these projects are being implemented. But obviously Zimbabwe's always been particularly high risk. So anyone who has invested there up until now has potentially been quite successful. This is obviously quite shocking news, just in terms of the extent of the 50% or whatever that's been announced. But I think people knew that if they're investing in Zimbabwe, it was high risk. Obviously, other countries are lower risk, and they've got more stable regimes who have maybe already signalled, slightly different arrangements that are going to be in place. But I think most project developers and early stage investors do quite a thorough political risk assessment, and hopefully, there's going to be more announcements over time, but hopefully governments will be sensible in so much as not going for policies which will, what's the expression, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. Because it's possible that what's been announced in Zimbabwe could actually kill the sector there, which is of benefit to nobody. Also, I don't think there's been that much explanation over the announcement in terms of what that would mean for benefit sharing on the ground. Like, of the money the government might take in the future, how would that be redistributed to, people on the ground? That would be my reaction.
And maybe just to add to that and kind of complement what Cheri was saying earlier, I had a conversation with the fine folks at MIGA from the World Bank, and I'm not sure if anyone's from there is in the room. And I said, what can you do for this type of political risk and regulatory risk that we're facing? And they said, not much yet. And I think, when we're talking about this overall market, the importance of blended finance, the importance of multilateral institutions and DFIs offering ways and tools to de-risk these types of projects for exactly these types of problems, which is, even if you do the best political risk analysis, you come to a point where you say, well, do I take the bet or not? And if we are trying to encourage more and more investments into these types of projects, you will need to have de-risking, and probably the best positioned institutions for doing those de-riskings are public institutions that have blended finance.
Yeah, and I would say, let's do a national jurisdictional program with Zimbabwe. I think there's an opportunity, and this is just the reality. I mean, Zimbabwe is not the first, and it won't be the last. We saw Indonesia, we saw Papua New Guinea, we saw other announcements coming out, and some of those have been, reversed. But Zambia passed a law in about 5 years ago that most people don't know about. And it's a very large country, right? And their law said, if you are in a jurisdiction where we are developing a jurisdictional program and you're operating a project, you have 3 years to wrap up, and basically you can sell credits through the government, and that's it. So, some version of that conversation is happening across the world and among all of these governments, and we can, with this interesting risk, insurance products that are coming out to mitigate that risk. There's ways that you can grandfather in projects to any future jurisdictional or national program. There's ways to get agreements in place with governments very early on that allow for that. So as long as you are engaging early and making sure that you are talking to the right people and you know that you are mitigating against that particular risk, I think it's something we can manage.
It's funny you should say insurance, because that's our next topic. I've been given the nod. Very sorry about you wanted to ask a question, but I'm sure the panel will be around at the next break. So please hit them up with your questions, get the business cards, and enjoy the rest of the session. Thank you.